Would you sacrifice one person to save 5 others? This deceptively simple question has haunted philosophers, ethicists, and now artificial intelligence researchers for over half a century. It's known as the trolley problem, and it goes like this. A runaway trolley is barreling down the tracks toward 5 people who will certainly die if it continues on its current path. You happen to be standing next to a lever that could divert the trolley to a different track. However, there is one person on that other track who would then certainly die. Should you pull the lever? If you're like most people, you probably think the answer is obvious. Of course you should pull the lever. Save 5 lives at the cost of 1. It's simple math, right? Across major research papers examining this scenario, between 80% to 90% of participants choose to pull the lever. A massive study involving 70,000 participants across 42 countries found that 81% of people would make the utilitarian choice to sacrifice 1 to save 5. But here's where things get interesting. That gut reaction, the one that seems so obviously correct to so many people, might be completely wrong. You see, the trolley problem isn't really about trolleys at all. It's about the fundamental nature of moral decision-making, the difference between action and inaction, and the thorny question of whether it's ever right to use one person as a mere means to save others. And in our modern world of self-driving cars, autonomous weapons, and artificial intelligence, these once theoretical questions have become frighteningly practical. What makes this philosophical puzzle even more fascinating is how dramatically people's answers change when you slightly modify the scenario. That initial moral certainty, the one that leads 90% of people to pull the lever, crumbles when we confront variations of the same basic problem. And as we'll see, your cultural background, professional training, and even the language you're using to think about the problem can dramatically influence your moral intuitions. So let's dive deep into this ethical maze, explore why your initial intuition might be leading you astray, and discover what the trolley problem reveals about the nature of moral decision-making in our increasingly complex world. Before we can understand why the trolley problem is so challenging, we need to examine the 3 major ethical frameworks that philosophers use to analyze moral decisions. Each offers a different lens through which to view the dilemma, and each leads us to surprisingly different conclusions. Let's start with utilitarianism, the ethical framework that focuses on achieving the greatest good for the greatest number of people. At first glance, utilitarianism seems to give us a clear answer to the trolley problem. Of course, you should pull the lever. 5 lives saved at the cost of 1 life is a net positive of 4 lives. The math is simple and straightforward. This is why so many people initially gravitate toward pulling the lever. We're often unconsciously applying utilitarian logic. But now let's consider deontological ethics, most famously articulated by Immanuel Kant. This framework focuses on absolute moral rules and duties, particularly the idea that we should never use a person merely as a means to an end. From this perspective, pulling the lever becomes deeply problematic. By diverting the trolley, you're actively using the death of one person as a means to save others. You're making a conscious choice to kill someone who would otherwise have lived. This isn't just allowing a death to happen, it's causing one. The third framework, virtue ethics, takes a completely different approach. Instead of focusing on consequences, like utilitarianism, or rules, like deontological ethics, virtue ethics asks what a person of good character would do in this situation. What virtues, courage, compassion, wisdom, justice, should guide our decision? A virtue ethicist might ask, what kind of person would I become by making this choice? What does it mean for my character if I'm willing to sacrifice one to save many? Each framework has its strengths and weaknesses. Utilitarianism offers clear, calculable answers, but can justify horrifying actions if they lead to greater good. Would you kill one healthy person to distribute their organs to 5 dying people? Deontological ethics provides firm moral boundaries, but can lead to seemingly irrational results where we allow greater harms to occur because we refuse to violate moral rules. Virtue ethics offers nuanced, character-based guidance, but can be frustratingly vague when we need clear answers to immediate problems. The complexity deepens when we look at how these frameworks play out in the real world. Consider the case of autonomous vehicles. Should they be programmed to always minimize casualties, utilitarian approach, never actively cause a death, deontological approach, or try to make decisions that reflect human virtues like compassion and fairness, virtue ethics? The challenges become even more apparent when we look at how different cultures approach these dilemmas. Research involving 70,000 participants across 42 countries revealed fascinating variations. While Western participants often favor utilitarian calculations, Eastern cultures frequently show stronger deontological tendencies. For example, Chinese participants were far less likely to support sacrificing one person to save many, possibly reflecting cultural values about fate and non-intervention. What's particularly interesting is how these ethical frameworks can conflict with our intuitive moral responses. Neuroimaging studies have shown that our brains process personal moral dilemmas, like physically pushing someone to their death, very differently from impersonal ones, like pulling a lever. The emotional centers of our brain light up more intensely when we contemplate direct personal harm, suggesting that our moral reasoning isn't as purely rational as we might like to think. This brings us to a crucial insight. Perhaps no single ethical framework is sufficient on its own. Just as a doctor might use multiple diagnostic tools to understand a complex medical condition, we might need all 3 ethical frameworks, and more, to fully grasp the moral complexity of difficult decisions. The trolley problem isn't just about finding the right answer. It's about understanding the different ways we can approach moral reasoning and the trade-offs inherent in each approach. Now let's run our first real stress test on these ethical frameworks. Instead of standing by a lever, imagine you're on a footbridge above the tracks. The same trolley is approaching, and the same 5 people are in danger. But this time, there's no lever. Instead, standing next to you is a very large man. So large that his body would definitely stop the trolley if he fell onto the tracks. The only way to save the 5 people is to push this man off the bridge, killing him, but stopping the trolley. If you're like most people, You probably felt an immediate emotional recoil at this scenario. Even though the mathematical equation remains exactly the same, sacrifice one life to save 5, something feels fundamentally different about pushing someone to their death versus pulling a lever. And the data backs this up. While 80–90% of people say they would pull the lever in the original scenario, studies show that only a small minority would push the man off the bridge. From a purely utilitarian perspective, nothing has changed. The outcome is identical. 1 death prevents 5 deaths. A strict utilitarian would argue that we should push the man. The net saving of 4 lives remains constant. The deontological framework, however, handles this variation quite differently. Remember, deontological ethics emphasizes that we should never use a person merely as a means to an end. In the original lever scenario, you could argue that the death of the one person is an unintended consequence of saving the 5. But in the fat man variation, you're explicitly using his body, his death, as the means of stopping the trolley. This crosses a fundamental moral line in deontological thinking. What's fascinating is how this variation reveals the gap between our rational minds and our emotional responses. Neuroimaging studies have shown that the fat man scenario activates different brain regions than the lever scenario. The footbridge dilemma triggers stronger activity in areas associated with emotional processing, particularly the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and amygdala. Meanwhile, the lever scenario activates regions associated with abstract reasoning and utilitarian calculations. Several factors are at play. Personal force. Pushing someone requires direct physical contact, making the action feel more personally violent than pulling a lever. Intention versus side effect. In the lever case, the death is a side effect of saving the 5. In the bridge case, the death is the means by which you save them. Agency and responsibility. Pulling a lever feels more like redirecting an existing threat, while pushing someone feels like creating a new threat. The cultural differences become even more pronounced in this variation. A study involving participants from 42 countries found that while Western respondents often struggled with the difference between the lever and bridge scenarios, East Asian participants showed an even stronger aversion to pushing the man. This has been attributed to cultural values about fate and the reluctance to actively interfere with destined outcomes. This variation also exposes a crucial weakness in pure utilitarian thinking. If we accept that it's right to push the fat man, what other actions might we justify in the name of greater good? Would it be right to kill a healthy person to distribute their organs to 5 dying patients? The fat man variation thus serves as more than just a thought experiment. It reveals the complex interplay between reason and emotion in moral decision-making. It suggests that our ethical frameworks must account for not just outcomes, but also the psychological and emotional reality of human moral reasoning. The gap between what we think we should do and what we feel we could do tells us something important about the nature of moral decision-making itself. Now, let's introduce a devilish variation that breaks our previous moral calculations in fascinating ways. In this scenario, the sidetrack loops back around to rejoin the main track. The 5 people are still in danger, and there's still one person on the sidetrack. But here's the twist. The only reason the trolley would stop before reaching the 5 people is that it would hit the one person on the sidetrack. Their body is what would halt the trolley. This loop track variation seems, at first glance, similar to the original lever case. You're still just pulling a lever after all. But ethically, it creates a profound challenge to our previous reasoning. In the original scenario, we could argue that the death of the one person was an unintended consequence of diverting the trolley. But in the loop track case, we're explicitly relying on that person's death to stop the trolley. Without their body to stop it, the trolley would simply loop around and kill the 5 people anyway. This is where we need to introduce a fascinating ethical principle: the doctrine of double effect. This principle, which plays a crucial role in medical ethics and military decision-making, suggests that an action that causes harm can be morally permissible if the harm wasn't intended, even if it was foreseen. For example, consider how this doctrine is applied in modern medical ethics. When doctors administer high doses of morphine to terminally ill patients, they know it might hasten death by suppressing respiratory function. But because their intention is to relieve suffering, not to cause death, this is considered ethically acceptable under the doctrine of double effect. But the loop track variation challenges this principle. Can we really claim we didn't intend the one person's death when we were counting on it to stop the trolley? The utilitarian calculation of 5 lives saved versus 1 lost starts to feel inadequate when we examine the role of intention more closely. This variation also reveals something profound about how we think about causation and moral responsibility. In the original scenario, we might tell ourselves that we're merely redirecting an existing threat. But the loop track forces us to confront the fact that we're creating a new causal chain that specifically requires someone's death. Military rules of engagement grapple with similar distinctions. Consider how they handle civilian casualty scenarios. There's a crucial difference between foreseeing that civilians might be killed as a side effect of attacking a military target versus intentionally using civilian deaths to achieve a military objective. Furthermore, real-world data from emergency response protocols shows how this distinction plays out in practice. Triage systems in mass casualty incidents often implicitly rely on the doctrine of double effect. Medical professionals may give priority to patients with better survival chances. Knowing this decision will likely result in the death of others. What makes this variation particularly challenging is how it reveals the fragility of our moral intuitions. Studies show that people's responses to the loop track variation often fall somewhere between their responses to the original lever scenario and the Fat Man scenario. The implications extend far beyond theoretical ethics. As we program autonomous vehicles to make split-second decisions, we have to grapple with these same questions of intention and foresight. Should a self-driving car swerve to avoid 5 pedestrians if doing so would certainly kill one person on the sidewalk? The loop track variation thus serves as a crucial bridge between our intuitive moral responses and more complex ethical reasoning. It shows us that even when the mathematical outcome remains the same, 1 death versus 5, the structure of intention and causation matters deeply to how we judge moral actions. Let's move from the theoretical to the practical. The trolley problem isn't just a thought experiment anymore. It's become a blueprint for some of the most challenging ethical decisions we face in technology, medicine, and artificial intelligence. Consider autonomous vehicles. Every day, engineers at companies like Tesla, Waymo, and other manufacturers are essentially programming trolley problem solutions into their cars' algorithms. When a crash is unavoidable, how should the vehicle respond? Should it prioritize its passengers' safety at all costs? Should it minimize total casualties? Should it never actively choose to harm a pedestrian? The real-world data is fascinating. Waymo's autonomous vehicles have demonstrated significantly better safety records than human drivers, with 84% fewer airbag deployment crashes and 73% fewer injury-causing crashes. But these statistics mask the complex ethical decisions embedded in their programming. When we examine the specific ethical guidelines programmed into these systems, we find a careful balance between utilitarian calculations, minimize total harm, and deontological rules, never actively cause harm to pedestrians. Let's shift to another real-world application: medical triage during disasters. When resources are limited and decisions must be made quickly, how do we choose who receives treatment? Hospital triage protocols have evolved significantly since 1900, particularly in response to major disasters and pandemics. During the COVID-19 pandemic, hospitals had to make devastating choices about ventilator allocation, essentially solving trolley problems in real time. The criteria used in these situations reveal how different ethical frameworks compete in practice. Utilitarian approach: save the most lives possible. Deontological rules: first come, first served, or absolute prohibitions against age discrimination. Virtue-based considerations: maintaining the moral integrity of healthcare workers. What's particularly interesting is how these frameworks often conflict in practice. During the COVID-19 pandemic, many hospitals established central triage committees to make these difficult decisions, removing the burden from individual doctors and nurses. This institutional approach attempted to balance utilitarian outcomes with the moral well-being of healthcare workers, a consideration that pure utilitarian calculations might overlook. Now let's examine artificial intelligence and ethical decision-making. Can we encode human moral reasoning into AI systems? The evolution of AI ethical frameworks since 2015 shows both progress and persistent challenges. While we can program rules and utility calculations, capturing the nuanced moral reasoning that humans employ remains elusive. Consider these real-world examples. Military AI systems must balance mission effectiveness with civilian casualty prevention. Financial AI must weigh profit optimization against fairness and social responsibility. Medical diagnosis: AI must balance accuracy with patient privacy and autonomy. Each of these domains reveals the practical limitations of our ethical frameworks. Utilitarianism's limitations: difficulty in quantifying different types of harm, challenge of accounting for long-term consequences, risk of justifying individual rights violations for collective benefit. Deontological limitations: rigid rules can lead to worse outcomes, difficulty in resolving conflicts between different rules, challenge of adapting to novel situations. Virtue ethics. Limitations. Hard to translate into programmable algorithms. Subjective interpretation of virtuous behavior. Cultural variations in virtue definitions. What's particularly revealing is how different cultures approach these practical challenges. For instance, Chinese approaches to autonomous vehicle ethics tend to emphasize harmony and collective welfare, while Western approaches often prioritize individual rights and clear liability rules. A study of 70,000 participants across 42 countries found significant cultural variations in how people believe autonomous vehicles should behave in crash scenarios. The reality is that no single ethical framework adequately addresses all real-world challenges. Instead, we're seeing the emergence of hybrid approaches that attempt to balance different moral considerations. 1. Primary rules. Basic deontological constraints that cannot be violated. 2. Utility calculations. Within those constraints, maximize positive outcomes. 3. Character considerations. Maintain public trust and ethical integrity. This hybrid approach might not be philosophically elegant, but it reflects how human moral reasoning actually works. Neuroimaging studies show that we employ different brain regions for different types of moral decisions, suggesting that our own ethical decision-making isn't confined to a single framework. The practical applications of the trolley problem thus teach us something profound. Perhaps the goal isn't to find the perfect ethical framework, but to understand how different moral approaches can complement each other in addressing real-world challenges. As we continue to develop technologies that must make autonomous moral decisions, this balanced approach becomes increasingly crucial. Now let's push our ethical frameworks to their breaking point with what might be the most challenging variation of all: the medical doctor scenario. Imagine you're a doctor with 5 patients who each need a different organ transplant to survive. A healthy patient comes in for a routine checkup. You realize that this one person's organs could save all 5 patients. Would you secretly euthanize the healthy patient to save the 5? Almost everyone recoils at this suggestion. Even hardcore utilitarians, who had no problem pulling the lever, or perhaps even pushing the fat man, often balk at this scenario. The math hasn't changed. It's still 1 life versus 5, but something feels profoundly different. The utilitarian calculation starts to reveal its limitations. If we truly believe in greatest good for the greatest number, shouldn't we support the doctor's actions? Some utilitarians might argue that the long-term consequences, the breakdown of trust in medical institutions, the chilling effect on people seeking medical care, would outweigh the immediate benefits. But this starts to feel like special pleading, an attempt to force our moral intuitions into a utilitarian framework, rather than letting the framework guide our decisions. The deontological approach seems to handle this case better, with its absolute prohibition on using people merely as means. But then we must ask, why does this prohibition feel stronger in the hospital than on the trolley tracks? Virtue ethics struggles too. What does it mean to be a virtuous doctor? The virtues of healing and saving lives seem to conflict with virtues of truthfulness and respect for human dignity. What makes this scenario particularly revealing is how it maps onto real-world ethical dilemmas in medicine. Consider how actual organ transplant committees prioritize recipients. These criteria represent an attempt to create an objective, systematic approach to literally deciding who lives and who dies. Yet even these carefully considered protocols can't completely resolve the underlying ethical tensions. The medical doctor variation also forces us to confront the role of context and social trust in ethical decision-making. Modern medical ethics evolved through painful lessons about what happens when we prioritize aggregate outcomes over individual rights. The Tuskegee syphilis study, for instance, might have produced valuable medical knowledge, but it did so at the cost of grievously violating human dignity and destroying institutional trust. This brings us to a crucial concept: moral uncertainty. Perhaps instead of trying to find the perfect ethical framework, we should acknowledge that moral truth is complex, contextual, and sometimes paradoxical. Just as physics needs both quantum mechanics and general relativity, frameworks that don't perfectly align but each capture important truths, perhaps we need multiple ethical frameworks to fully grasp moral reality. This approach to moral uncertainty suggests that when faced with difficult ethical decisions, we should consider multiple ethical frameworks, acknowledge the limitations of each approach, recognize the role of context and consequences, remain humble about our ability to resolve all ethical conflicts, and build systems that reflect this complexity rather than trying to reduce it to simple rules. Neuroimaging studies support this more nuanced view. When people grapple with complex moral decisions, multiple brain regions activate. Areas associated with emotional processing, rational calculation, and social cognition all engage simultaneously. The breaking point of our ethical frameworks thus reveals something profound. The goal of moral philosophy might not be to find the one true ethical theory, but to develop a richer understanding of how different moral intuitions and frameworks interact. Just as a doctor uses multiple diagnostic tools to understand a complex condition, we might need multiple ethical frameworks to fully grasp difficult moral challenges. This more nuanced approach doesn't make ethical decisions easier, but it might make them better. By acknowledging the complexity of moral truth, we can build more sophisticated systems for handling difficult decisions, whether in medicine, technology, or public policy. The trolley problem, in all its variations, isn't just about finding the right answer. It's about understanding the nature of moral reasoning itself.